When Moses Cleaveland arrived at the mouth of the Cuyahoga River in 1796, our region was about 94% forest. He assigned a group of men to plot out the land in the area and evaluate its value. What kinds of trees were there? How dominant were they? And what kind of agriculture was the land best suited for? Now, more than 200 years later, the forest city looks a whole lot different. IdeaStream's Elizabeth Miller begins her story on the east side of Cuyahoga County at the Cleveland Metro Park's North Chagrin Reservation.
Only a few spots exist today that provide an example of what Cuyahoga County may have looked like 200 years ago. A.B. Williams Memorial Woods is one of them. A national natural landmark, it's home to centuries-old beech and maple trees. It's the type of landscape that James Arbuckle would have seen in 1806. He was one of the men Moses Cleaveland assigned to survey the land west of the Cuyahoga River.
He was one of the worst surveyors in terms of doing his job, but he had a lot of interesting comments. So he said things like, "This mile the land is too good to talk about. Timber, beech, sugar tree, basswood, walnut, popular, and everything that is good." So I love that. And sometimes he was cranky. He wrote, "Small timber as thick set as the hair on a dog's back." And, he would write down what he had for breakfast or whatever.
Flynn is reading from a copy of Arbuckle's land survey book. Along with a Baldwin Wallace student, Flynn spent years poring over journals like Arbuckle's as part of a newly published study on Cuyahoga County's tree history compared to today's.
These records are such a goldmine of ecological information, and I just find it fascinating to be able to look back in time and see what forests were like 200 years ago. When I moved here to Cleveland, I found out that no one had done this for our region at all. So I was excited to be able to finally do a study like this and look at the early survey records. You can find out a lot from these records. One, you can find out the species composition of the forests. What different forest types were most common. And you can also find out a lot about the types of habitats, so how much of the landscape was forested versus in wetlands or other types of open habitats.
Turns out things have really changed in Cuyahoga County over 214 years. The region went from 94% forest to a little under 20%. Half of the county's wetlands are gone. And there was a big increase in development, from 0 to 77%. But what about the trees?
Well, in 1800, we found that about half of the landscape was covered by forests dominated by beech, and about a third of the landscape was in oak forests. The remainder was dominated by maples, chestnut, ash, and a number of other species.
Flynn created a map out of the more than 1,200 surveyed lines, showing what trees were most dominant and where. The color of each line shows which tree species was most dominant in 1800. The study also looked for signs of permanent Native American settlements, but only found notes about Native American paths and one Indian sugar camp. Flynn says over the 200 years there was a decline in beech-dominated forests and an increase in maple-dominated forests.
The factor that best explained the changes that we observed was the life history strategy of these species. We found that species that are well adapted to disturbance were the ones that increased the most. And maples fall into that category.
Common local disturbances included logging and farming. Across town from A.B. Williams Woods, in Parma, Cleveland Metro Park's ecologist Dr. Constance Hausman stands in front of a forest of red maples on a windy day.
The forest that we're standing in front of is a fairly young, even-aged stand of red maple forest. So this is an even-aged red maple forest. And so likely prior to this forest, which is only about 50 years old, 40, 50 years old, this land would have been cleared. And whether or not that previous land use history was for agriculture, farming, pasture of some nature, these young ruderal red maple tree species colonized all at a very similar time, and thus they're all about the same age. There's not a lot of diversity here. There's not a lot of different types of trees. There's not a lot of richness or unique habitat.
Today, the county's forests tend to be more homogeneous, dominated by the same set of species, like maple. And while it's better to have some trees than no trees at all, Hausman says the lack of variety can mean a lack in other things.
It's important to have healthy forested systems that capture and reflect a variety of different tree species, of different age classes and different structure. The greater the variety and the species richness of an area, the greater amount of wildlife and habitat those communities can support by providing food resource, nest sites, and structure available for all wildlife.
For Professor Flynn at BW, the data shows a dramatic change in a short period of time. A forest city that's lost its forests.
This is a forest region, and I think it's important that we think of ourselves with that identity. We live in a forested region, or a region that was forested and would be forested if not for us.
Flynn says her study can be used by planners for future restoration projects. The information shows what kinds of trees and plants might be more resilient and in what areas they can thrive. Flynn says it also points out the need for forest restoration, especially beech and oak forests. But the Cleveland Metro Parks Hausman says this kind of information is also about learning where you come from and where Cuyahoga County's development started.
It's all about change, right? So trying to understand who we are and where we're going is influenced directly by where we've been. And so those old historic data sets give us an opportunity to understand and respect and value the land in its original condition.
Elizabeth Miller reporting. Thank you.